Well, here we are at Connect Season 2, 2019. Can't believe it. It just seems that this year's flying along. This season, we're going to be looking at gifts. The first part of the season, we've got 4 studies on spiritual gifts taken from 1 Corinthians 12 and 1 Corinthians 14. In this first session, I want to look at what I've called the gift collection. The church at Corinth was an amazing church, a very colourful church in many different ways. Paul writes 2 letters that we have. Some would say that there was another letter that's now lost. But Paul writes to the Corinthian church, and it was a church that it had its own issues, it had more than a few problems. But nevertheless, Paul actually commended the Corinthian church because it was, as he put it, it didn't come behind in any spiritual gifts. So spiritual gifts was something that they had an understanding of, and spiritual gifts were in evidence in the Corinthian church. But nevertheless, when we get to 1 Corinthians 12 and 1 Corinthians 14 in particular, we find that Paul feels that he has the need to talk to this church about spiritual gifts. So I hope that as we look at what Paul says to the church at Corinth, that it will help our understanding and our use of spiritual gifts within our groups. In this study, I want to look at what I've called the spiritual gift collection, or the gift collection. 1 Corinthians 12, 4-6 says, there are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit distributes them. There are different kinds of service, but the same Lord. There are different kinds of working, but in all of them and in every one, it is the same God at work. So, what about these gifts? What sorts of gifts do we have? Well, 1 Corinthians 12, 8-10 lists what have classically been known as the 9 gifts of the Spirit. Now, just to explain, there are more than 9 gifts. When you look at other passages in the Bible, particularly Romans chapter 12, Ephesians 4, and then going all the way over to 1 Peter 5, you find that there are other lists of gifts and other references to gifts. And even in 1 Corinthians 12, if you go towards the end of the chapter, you find that Paul lists other gifts, like gifts of organization or administration, gifts of miracles, apostles, teachers, helping. So this list is in no way intended to be exhaustive. But let me read out to you what these gifts are that Paul lists here. He talks about the message of wisdom, and I'm basing all of this on the New International Version of the Bible. You might have a different translation, but this is the way it translates. The message of wisdom, the message of knowledge, faith, gifts of healing, miraculous powers, prophecy, distinguishing between spirits, speaking in different kinds of tongues, and then interpretation of tongues. So, what do we know about these different gifts? Well, first of all, if you take a look at verses 4-7 and verses 19-20, the gifts are divine and diverse. They have a divine origin. Again, looking back at verses 4-7, Paul talks about different gifts, but the same Spirit, the same Lord, and the same God. So they all come from God. The Spirit's involved, Jesus is involved, and God the Father's involved. So the whole of the Trinity is involved in spiritual gifts. They're not human abilities. They're not based on your personality. They're not based on your education, your background, your training. They are gifts that have a divine origin. A second thing to recognize here is to recognize the diversity of the gifts. Again, verses 4-7, Paul says there are different kinds of gifts, different kinds of service, different kinds of working. And the lists in 8-10 and verse 28 emphasize this point. And just to make sure that no one misses the point, Paul compares the way that the gifts in the body of Christ are distributed and work together as being like the human body. Verses 19 and 20, he says, if they were all one part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, but one body. So it's like Paul's saying, you've got all these different gifts, and without all these different gifts, you need all these different gifts to make up the body of Christ in a way that's similar to all the different parts of the human body go to making up one body. So that's his illustration. So the gifts are divine in origin and they're diverse. The gifts are also given so that the body of Christ is built up. So gifts build community. Look at verse 7. It says, now to each one, manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. It's a very, very important point. And it's possibly the most important point in everything Paul says about spiritual gifts. One of the problems that the Corinthians had was that they were focusing on probably one gift in particular, speaking in tongues, to the neglect of all the others. And it was almost as if they had lost a hold of the purpose of spiritual gifts in the first place, because Paul explains that the gifts are given to actually build up the body, whereas the Corinthians, it seems, were in danger of seeing speaking in tongues in particular as a sign of their own spirituality. It's also why Paul devotes chapter 13 to love. He effectively says that you can have all the gifts in the world, but if there's no love in your life, then your gifts are pointless. Isn't it interesting that between 1 Corinthians 12 and 1 Corinthians 14, we have this chapter on love. It's not as though Paul started out talking about the gifts and then thought, I'd better write something that people can read out at a wedding, and then got back to spiritual gifts again in chapter 14. No, his whole point is that the gifts are there for building other people up and should be used in love. Notice too the way that Paul describes the gifts. He talks about manifestations of the Spirit. Sometimes when the Spirit's poured out, people react in all sorts of different ways, and sometimes people talk about the manifestation that they receive. Well, actually, a lot of that behavior isn't a manifestation of the Spirit. It's simply a reaction or a response to what the Spirit is doing. The manifestation of the Spirit is an actual spiritual gift that God gives to build others up. So the Spirit manifests himself through spiritual gifts, and through those gifts, he enables us to build up the church community. The gifts are also complementary. The gifts of the Spirit complement each other in the way that different parts, in the same way or in a similar way to in which different parts of the human body complement each other. The church is a body made up of many parts, 12 verses 12 to 14. And this has a number of implications. Every part of the body of Christ is essential. If you think of a human body, if you think of your own body, it's essential for all the parts to be functioning well, for the whole body to be functioning well. And Paul makes a similar part about spiritual gifts. We are not, in making this point, Paul is saying that we are interdependent. It's not that we depend on each other, and it's not that we're independent of each other, but for the body of Christ to function properly, there has to be interdependency. A second thing about these complementary gifts is that some of the most important parts don't get much profile. If you look at verses 2 to 25, Paul talks about the parts that aren't seen and the parts that are covered up because of modesty. These are parts of the body that are essential. If you think of your heart or your liver or your brain, no one can see those parts, but yet if you're without those parts, you really are in big trouble. And of course, there are some parts of the human body that we cover up because of modesty. There are people in the church that do things behind the scenes that work very hard and that have very little public profile and certainly don't have a high profile, but they are absolutely essential to the effective functioning of the church. And even if those people don't get honored, even if we don't always remember to honor them or thank them, and we can be sure, according to verse 24, that God honors them. So you might do all sorts of things behind the scene which are incredibly important. In fact, sometimes you mightn't even realize how important they are. And you might never hear a word of thanks, you might never be honored publicly, but just remember that God sees what you do and God will honor you. So one part of the body, according to Paul, is just as important as another part of the body for the body to function correctly. And there's another thing that comes out of this, the gifts being complementary, is that we have a connection to each other, an emotional connection to each other. Look at verse 26. Paul says that, when one part's in pain, the rest of the body's in pain. When one part rejoices, the rest of the body rejoices. So it is with human bodies, with the body of Christ. If I have pain in my finger, it affects the whole of my body. If someone is in pain in the life of the church or in your group, and I think it's important to say that these gifts probably work best in smaller groups. But when one part of your group is in pain, the rest of the group feels it. So there we are. God has given the church an amazing and diverse collection of gifts. I pray that as you spend some time reflecting on the scriptures in 1 Corinthians 12 and looking over the study notes, that you'll be informed, you'll be enlightened, but that you'll also be encouraged and inspired to seek those gifts for yourself so that you can build up one another.